For the love of God, just tip your waiter. I have spent most of my adult life being polite to people who would never be polite back. That sounds bitter when I read it back, but it's just the truth. If you work in restaurants long enough, especially in places where the menu doesn't list prices and the lighting is dim, you learn early on that your livelihood depends on reading moods, swallowing pride, and smiling through situations that would never fly anywhere else. My name is Anthony. 31 male. At the time this happened, I was 29 years old and working at a fine dining restaurant that prided itself on being an experience. It was the kind of place where reservations were booked weeks in advance, the wine list was a small novel, and the servers were expected to know the origin story of every ingredient on the plate. I was good at my job. Not in a flashy way, but in the dependable way managers loved and customers rarely noticed. I anticipated needs, corrected mistakes before they reached the table, and absorbed stress without letting it spill over. I made enough in tips to pay rent, helped my younger brother when he needed it, and even save a little on the side. Josephine worked there too. She was a host when I started, and moved into a serving position not long after. When I was calm and methodical, Josephine was sharp. She noticed things before anyone else. She remembered faces and also names. She caught the subtle signs that a table was going to be trouble long before they ever raised their voice. We weren't dating at first. Nobody in the industry ever makes it official immediately. We bonded the way restaurant people bond, through shared exhaustion and whispered commentary in the server alley. Over time, that turned into shared meals after closing. Then rides home, then something unspoken but steady. The restaurant ran on a strict tip-out system. A percentage of our sales went to buses, runners, bartenders, and hosts. Regardless of what we actually earned from the table, if a guest didn't tip, we still paid out of pocket. That detail matters later. The woman who caused this story came in on a Thursday night. She was alone, well-dressed, mid-50s, and carrying herself with the confidence of someone who knew exactly how she wanted things done. She requested a corner table, asked detailed questions about substitutions, and made it clear from the beginning that she had high expectations. I didn't think much of it. People like her came in every night. She ordered slowly. She sent back a glass of wine because it wasn't decanted long enough. She asked for bread, but specified she wanted it warm, not toasted. She wanted her steak medium, but not pink. Every request was reasonable on its own, but stacked together, they created a rhythm that demanded constant attention. And I gave it to her. Her meal went smoothly. When she finished, she asked for a dessert menu, but then decided she didn't want dessert after all. When she asked for the check, the bill was just over $200. She signed the receipt, stood up, and left. I didn't look at the tip line right away. You learn not to, at least not until the table is gone. When I finally checked, the line was empty. She left nothing. No note, no complaint, no gratuity with a comment. Just a blank line and a firm signature. That meant I had paid to serve her. After tip-out, I was down nearly $30 on that table alone. Josephine noticed my mood before I said anything. She didn't need to ask. She just nodded slowly and said she'd seen the woman before. She doesn't tip. Josephine told me later that night, casually, like she was talking about the weather. Evra asked how she knew. She comes in once or twice a month. Always alone, and always runs you. And at the end, she always leaves nothing. I assumed management would know. They did, but didn't care. The restaurant had a policy against automatic gratuity unless the party was 6 or more. Management's stance was that we should deliver exceptional service regardless of outcome, and that tipping was discretionary. What they didn't say out loud was that the restaurant still got paid. The kitchen still got paid, and of course, management still got paid. Only the server absorbed the loss. When she came in again, 2 weeks later, she was sat in my section. That wasn't an accident. Our floor manager believed in rotating challenges. If a table was difficult or known for stiffing, he would deliberately assign them to different servers so no one felt singled out. That logic sounded fair in theory. In practice, it meant we all took turns losing money. I gave her perfect service again. I was attentive but not overbearing. I apologized when she sent back a dish for being slightly off. The bill was higher this time, yet she tipped nothing again. By the third visit, Josephine was involved too. She wasn't serving her, but she watched from the host's stand as the woman was seated. "You're in for it," she warned me quietly. I shrugged it off publicly and simmered privately. By the fifth time serving her, I started to notice something else. The woman wasn't just not tipping, she was evaluating us. She watched how we reacted. She noted whether we stayed pleasant. She looked almost disappointed when nothing went wrong. There was a strange satisfaction in her expression when she stood up from the table, knowing she'd just taken time, energy, and money from someone who couldn't push back. I started to dread seeing her name on the reservation list. Josephine started to dread it too. Even when she wasn't the one serving her, the first time her behavior truly cost me something tangible. It wasn't money, it was reputation. The restaurant operated on internal notes attached to reservations. Allergies, preferences, prior complaints. Management encouraged us to document patterns so service could be tailored accordingly. After her 6th visit, a note appeared under her profile. "Guest is very particular. Ensure close attention." That note didn't come from me. It came from the woman herself, through management. Framed in corporate language that softened the reality of what she was doing, she had complained. Not loudly or in person. She sent an email the next morning. She praised the ambience and the food. But then she mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that she felt rushed during her last visit and that the server seemed more concerned with other tables. I had 12 tables that night, but I had checked on her more than any of them. Management called me into the office 2 days later. It wasn't a reprimand, exactly. It was a conversation filled with careful phrasing and sympathetic nods. Where nothing concrete was said, but everything was implied, I was reminded that our guests expected perfection and encouraged me to be more present. I was told that feedback like hers was valuable. Josephine waited for me after my shift. She could tell something was off by the way I moved through side work slower than usual. "She complained, didn't she?" Josephine asked, and I nodded. Josephine didn't look surprised, she looked angry. "That's what she does," she said with an eye roll. From that point on, every time the woman came in, there was a quiet tension that rippled through the staff. Whoever had her table that night knew they'd be walking a tightrope. Josephine served her once. I watched from across the room. Josephine was better than excellent. She delivered service so precise it bordered on clinical. She was warm without being familiar, attentive without hovering. The woman still left nothing. Later that night, Josephine showed me the receipt. The tip line wasn't just blank this time. The woman had written a 0. The woman began coming more frequently. Once, sometimes twice in a week. Always requesting the same general area. Always alone, and always running the server. Just enough to create stress without causing a scene. Management noticed the increased visits, and were pleased. Loyal guest, they call her. They never acknowledged the tip issue directly. When it was brought up, the response was always the same. Tipping was optional, and service was mandatory. What management didn't account for was how demoralizing it was to serve someone who cost you money while being expected to treat them like royalty. I started picking up extra shifts to compensate. Josephine started to change too. She grew quieter. On nights when the woman was in the building, the breaking point came on a Saturday night during peak hours. The woman was seated in my section again. We were fully booked with a packed dining room. She ordered as usual, complicated and specific. Halfway through the meal, she waved me over and calmly informed me that her dish was wrong. It wasn't, but she insisted it was. I offered to have it remade, and she agreed with a thin smile. The kitchen remade it begrudgingly. I expedited it personally, even though the kitchen was in the throes of Saturday night chaos. When it arrived, she inspected it and said nothing. At the end of the night, she asked to speak to a manager. She told him I had been dismissive and that I made her feel like an inconvenience. She said she might reconsider coming back. Management apologized profusely, and of course she left without tipping. The next week, my section was smaller. Josephine noticed before I did. "She's costing you tables," she said quietly. This wasn't just about pride or principle anymore. This was about job security, and the woman knew it. By the time management officially cut my hours, I already knew it was happening. No one announces that kind of thing directly, they let it show up in subtler ways. Fewer weekend shifts, more weekday lunches, and more texts saying we're fully staffed tonight that get sent an hour before doors opened. My name slid lower on the rotation list, not enough to raise alarms, but enough to feel intentional. Josephine noticed everything, as always she noticed that the woman's reservation notes had grown longer and more detailed, none of them positive. She noticed that management never questioned the pattern of complaints, despite the lack of actual mistakes. She noticed that every complaint was vague enough to be unprovable and serious enough to sound credible, and she noticed that the woman was being careful. She never raised her voice. She never insulted anyone outright. She never wrote anything overtly aggressive. Everything she did was technically acceptable. Every action sat just inside the boundaries of policy, like she had studied the rules and learned exactly how far she could push without triggering a defensive response. Josephine started documenting in her own way. She kept a notebook in her bag. She wrote down the days she came in and her order details. She noted if something got returned and the reasons, as well as the complaints that followed. There was definitely a pattern. Every server who had her more than 3 times saw a reduction in hours within the following month. No one lost their job. That would have raised questions. Instead, they were slowly starved for shifts and tables. A quiet nudge towards burnout. I started to feel paranoid before I started to feel angry. I wondered if I was imagining it. That's what makes this kind of conflict so insidious. There's no single explosive moment. Just a steady erosion of stability. Josephine never doubted me. "She's targeting people," she said one night after closing, her voice low. "She knows exactly what she's doing." I asked why, and Josephine didn't answer right away. She flipped through her notebook, stopping at a page she had marked. "She used to work in hospitality," Josephine said. I found her LinkedIn. That stopped me. Josephine explained that she had recognized the woman's last name on her credit card from an old training document used by a restaurant group years ago. It had bothered her enough to look it up. The profile wasn't active anymore, but it was still there. A decade-long career in restaurant management. She knew the system. She knew how complaints were handled. She knew how management responded to liability. She knew how to sound reasonable while applying pressure. And she knew exactly how much power a loyal guest had over a replaceable server. Once I saw it through that lens, everything made sense. The woman didn't need to tip. Because she wasn't there for the service. She was there for some kind of twisted power high. She wasn't an unknowing customer who was oblivious to how tip-out worked. She knew she was costing me money, and there was nothing that I could do about it. The restaurant rewarded her behavior. Every comped item and every apology reinforced the idea that she was right to demand more while giving less. The final straw came during a staff meeting. Management praised our commitment to guest satisfaction and reminded us that every guest experience mattered. Then, without naming names, they mentioned that certain servers needed to reassess their approach. To avoid making guests feel uncomfortable, everyone knew who that was about. I felt my face heat up as people avoided looking at me. The accusation hung in the air, vague and undeniable. After the meeting, Josephine didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Instead, she suggested something I hadn't considered. She's counting on us staying quiet. She said, "We didn't talk about revenge. Not in the cinematic sense. There were no fantasies of confrontation or public humiliation. That wouldn't work anyway. The system protected her. So, we looked at the system instead, and for the first time since this started, I felt something close to control again." The restaurant prided itself on documentation. Every interaction, complaint, and accommodation left a trail. Even when it didn't feel like it in the moment. Josephine understood that better than anyone. We started submitting incident reports and writing our own notes in her file. Each dish she repeatedly sent back, and the specific wines she kept ordering, even though she knew she didn't like them. As she came in more often, we left more notes. Every returned dish, every complaint that contradicted previous feedback, and every instance where the woman's requests changed mid-service. Every zero tip, noted not as an expectation but as a data point. We never framed it as a problem guest, we framed it as a consistency issue. Management couldn't dismiss consistency. Other servers quietly joined in once they realized what was happening. No one wanted to be the next server to get cut before their shift even began. The reports piled up slowly, without fanfare. The woman noticed the shift. Service didn't change in quality, but it changed in tone. There were fewer apologies and fewer unnecessary check-ins. Suddenly, there were fewer opportunities to provoke a reaction. She tested boundaries harder. More returns, more sighs, and more pointed comments designed to elicit discomfort. But for the first time, nothing worked. She still didn't tip, obviously, but something else started happening. Her complaints stopped being rewarded. No more comps, no more gift cards. And no more hovering managers for extended conversations. When management saw the same Chardonnay, she ordered and sent back 3 separate times. Even they started recognizing a pattern. She didn't like that. Her visits became less frequent, and when she did come in, she stayed shorter and ordered less. Josephine uncovered one final piece that tied everything together. The restaurant group was preparing for a regional audit. Guest satisfaction metrics were under review, and patterns mattered more than ever. The woman never returned after that month. If she was banned, I wasn't told about it. She was just gone one day, and we never saw her again. A guest who repeatedly complained without resolution and never tipped wasn't a loyal guest. She was a liability. The day management called me into the office again, I expected the worst. Instead, they thanked me. They said they had reviewed recent documentation, and they appreciated professionalism under pressure. They restored my hours the following week. No apology, no admission of guilt. Restaurants like this never do. But it was enough. When the woman stopped coming in, nothing happened at first. That was the strangest part. No announcement. No acknowledgement. No sense of closure. Her absence didn't arrive with relief, so much as uncertainty. Like a noise that had been constant for so long that its disappearance felt unnatural. I still looked for her for weeks. Every time I checked the reservation list before a shift, my eyes scanned automatically for her name. Every time the host's stand filled up, I half expected to see her coat and her practiced confidence. Even when I knew she wasn't there, my body still reacted as if she might be. Stress doesn't shut off just because the source disappears. The restaurant moved on faster than I did. New guests filled her usual table. New complaints cycled through the system, ordinary ones this time. The kind that came from misunderstandings. Or genuine mistakes, not calculated pressure. Management responded the way they always had, with surface-level concern and corporate phrasing. But something underneath had shifted. Josephine noticed it first, as usual. She pointed out that managers were asking more follow-up questions when complaints came in. Not accusatory questions, but clarifying ones. They wanted specifics now. The woman had forced that change without ever knowing it. Her documentation sat in the system, like a fossil layer, undeniable when viewed all at once. A single complaint can be dismissed, two can be coincidence. But months of them, all following the same shape, could not. I started receiving better shifts again with prime sections. My signature weekend doubles and clopens came back in all of their glory. The financial pressure eased slowly, the way it had built. I caught up on credit cards I had been abusing since the beginning of all of this mess. I stopped calculating every purchase down to the dollar. What surprised me most was how much space her absence created mentally. I hadn't realized how much energy I'd been spending bracing myself, how many small decisions I made through the lens of don't give her a reason. Without that constant background threat, my attention returned to the job itself. I was finally good at my job again. Josephine and I grew closer in that quiet space. Not dramatically, just steadily. Without the shared tension, we had room to talk about things beyond survival. The idea that maybe this restaurant, which had once felt like a destination, was really just a chapter. The longer the woman stayed gone, the more obvious something became. She had never been special, she had been enabled. The system had worked exactly as designed, prioritizing perceived guest satisfaction over staff well-being until enough data forced it to acknowledge the imbalance. Nothing about her behavior had changed. The system had. And that realization made it easier to leave. When I finally gave my 2-week notice, it felt less like quitting and more like graduating from a lesson I hadn't volunteered to learn. Management expressed surprise, the kind that comes from never quite seeing employees as people, but more like resources that would somehow always replenish. Josephine gave her notice a couple days later. On my last shift, I served efficiently, professionally, without sentimentality. I completed side work, signed out, and walked to my car without looking back at the dining room. As unceremonious as the final shift was, everybody who understands the people who work in the service industry knows the celebratory drinks after at the usual bar were immaculate. Although I couldn't remember specifics if I tried, I'm pretty sure the line cooks kept ordering me new drinks and swapping out my empty glasses without me realizing. For the first time in a long time, the silence of being away from the restaurant didn't feel ominous. Time has a way of flattening experiences that once felt enormous. Josephine and I carried the experience into our next jobs, not as bitterness, but as clarity. We recognized early warning signs now. We understood that professionalism does not require self-sacrifice without limit. We spoke up for ourselves without apology. We didn't wait to be starving before protecting ourselves. I sometimes wonder if the woman ever realized what changed. If she noticed that her usual leverage no longer produced results. If the lack of reaction confused her more than open resistance would have. I suspect it did, since she had never returned. Power like hers only functions when it's invisible and it feels natural, when the people affected by it blame themselves instead of the system allowing it. But when that illusion breaks, there's nothing left to grip. She never once tipped any of us. But she ended up losing the one thing she had been paying for all along. Control. And she lost it quietly. Without confrontation, without validation, and without the satisfaction of knowing she had mattered enough to be fought. As for me, I stopped confusing endurance with virtue. I learned that being polite doesn't mean being passive. Professionalism includes protecting your own stability. That systems can change when patterns are made visible, even if no one ever admits fault. The most frustrating conflicts don't always end with justice. Sometimes they just end with distance.